time now to take a look at some of the day's top business news. And for that, I'm joined in the studio by Cole Stangler. Hi, Cole.
Yeah, Axie.
You're starting with negotiations in the US Congress over that landmark $1.9 trillion stimulus plan. What's the latest there?
So the Biden administration reportedly agreeing to a small cut in that recovery bill. Now, that compromise designed to win support from Democrats in the Senate would see fewer Americans receive so-called stimulus checks. Those are those direct payments of $1,400 on the table. Latest proposal would basically limit eligibility for those checks. Anyone earning less than $75,000 a year would still receive one, but they would now be phased out entirely for those earning more than $80,000. The original bill, backed by the White House, set that amount at $100,000. It's all designed to pave the way for Democrats to stay united and approve that stimulus plan. The Senate is slated to kick off debate as early as today. Talking to House Democrats on Wednesday, Joe Biden said the plan's still a popular and necessary piece of legislation.
And this is a case where every single piece of the bill you passed addresses a genuine, desperate need for the American people. Each piece isn't just defensible, it is urgent and overwhelmingly supported by the people. It's good policy and it's good politics.
And next up, Cole, German carrier Lufthansa has reported a record loss.
That's right. The airline says it lost some 6.7 billion euros last year. Its CEO calling it, quote, one of the most challenging years in the firm's history. With the pandemic grinding travel to a halt, Lufthansa recorded around a 60% decline in revenue when compared to the previous year. The carrier also digging in for a slow recovery. It says it expects to reach around 90% of its 2019 flight capacity by the middle of the decade. Let's take a look now at some of the day's trading action. Asian markets in solidly negative territory. That's being driven by concern over rising U.S. bond yields. That means an uptick in long-term borrowing costs. As you can see here, the Nikkei closing down more than 2% losses across the board, meanwhile, in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Seoul. Oil prices on the rise, meanwhile, as you can see there, benchmark Brent crude trading at over $64 a barrel. It's ahead of today's meeting of OPEC Plus, a group of oil-producing countries and allies. They'll be deciding whether or not to raise output after months of keeping supply low. Some investors, though, evidently not convinced a hike is coming, judging by those movements there.
Now, Cole, Fashion Week here in Paris has kicked off. A Fashion Week that's rather different to what we've seen in previous years, it must be said.
That's right. Also similar to what we've seen in New York, London, and Milan. This year's edition taking place almost entirely online. Luke Strego has more on how the pandemic has driven the fashion industry to overhaul its business model.
What a difference a year makes. From the tightly packed crowds of Paris Fashion Week 2020 to an almost entirely digital edition, where designers have taken things mostly online, and it's been more successful than many would have suspected.
I think there's been a real shift in the balance of power that was already happening. Again, it was happening pre-pandemic, but now there's proof of concept that if you want to ignore Fashion Week, it's probably not going to hurt your bottom line.
Certain labels like Gucci and Tommy Hilfiger sat out Fashion Week entirely this year. Seeking ways to deal with the global supply chain problems and COVID restrictions, going virtual means not just far less in terms of organization and costs, but opening up Fashion Week to an even wider audience than before, particularly in an industry that's already sought to target younger demographics through social media. Insiders think the changes may just be here to stay, even when things begin getting back to normal.
I think particularly for businesses, this maybe as we go back to shows, we'll have smaller shows. We'll also be thinking about the assets and the way they can engage with these audiences that actually have been big supporters of them through this past year and been championing their creativity and collections and have been an inspiration to the brands and to the designer businesses to really keep them going.
That'll likely be music to ears on the other side of fashion. The entire textile industry is going through an unprecedented economic crisis, with non-essential businesses shuttered for much of the pandemic and orders for both raw material and clothing drying up over the last 12 months.
And finally, it's the end of an era in Las Vegas. The firm Las Vegas Sands is selling its historic Venetian casino resort for some $6.25 billion. Plans to use the proceeds to continue its expansion in Singapore and Macau in particular. That's where it's planning a London-themed resort along with David Beckham. The firm has long been the biggest operator on the iconic Vegas Strip, but after this sale, it won't have a spot on the famous avenue. The move comes 2 months after the death of longtime owner Sheldon Adelson. And Haxi also comes, of course, with the casino industry reeling from the pandemic, one of just many sectors we've seen to be hit by this crisis.
OK, Cole Stangler with a look through the day's top business stories. Thank you very much.